Blender is one of the many tools used by professionals on the YouTube platform. With the right skill and time put into learning and using it, you can really make beautiful videos with it. One of my favourite content creators with Blender is a channel named Pixelated, a channel who makes videos on parts of backrooms and Attack on Titan manga. My main inspiration for this is from the YouTube video I forced myself to learn Blender in 100 hours, where the guy makes a Star Wars based background while forcing himself to learn Blender in the space of 100 hours, and actually did a pretty good job of it. Which leads to the question, is it possible to learn Blender in 1 week? Conditions for this is that the days are done on Blender will not be done simultaneously, as there will be days where I will be busy and unable to work on this. Days where I can work on it will need a minimum 3+ hours. Tutorials and anything that can be used to help me learn how to do it are allowed in between the days, so the days when I'm busy won't be put to waste. I should probably mention that I do have some experience using Blender before. I first installed it late 2020, but made extremely slow progress before uninstalling it for storage space. I have a lot more storage space now. I can navigate quite well and some tools, but that's pretty much just it. For the first day, I wanted to keep things simple. My first task would be to make a model of a Mr. Pixelated logo, and me being my stupid self thought it would be easy to make because, hey, pixel art is easy, right? So anyways, day 1 was a complete disaster. I thought it would be very easy to do, but it was in fact the opposite. My good friend Floke's Animations was much better than me in using Blender all the way back in 2020, and managed to model and texture a sprite for the Mr. Pixelated series. Go watch episode 4 by the way. And it looks really good. Me, being a fool, thought it was really easy, decided to make it, and this disaster was its result. I started off with adding a plane and placing it on the reference of my Mr. Pixelated logo. After messing around with it for 10 minutes, I figured out the scaling tool, which I figured was something that was going to be essential for later on, which it was. Using the scaling tool, I shrunk down the plane to the size of 1 pixel and used that as my base of my logo, where I'll begin to model it using the extend option. Modeling M and R was pretty decent. It wasn't until I got to P where there started to be real problems, such as there being 2 vertices at the same time, overlapping each other. It only got worse. By the time I got to the end, I would have had about 4 vertices at the same place, and at the same time, it was becoming increasingly difficult. Needless to say, halfway through modeling, I could already tell that this wasn't going to be ending well, but I wanted to see how it turned out. After finishing it, I made a 3D, and I was extremely disappointed in myself. But it was expected. But I guess you gotta learn from your mistakes. After the atrocity that was day 1, while playing a game of Wii Sports, I realised how basic the Mii model was, and figured that instead of forcing myself to do just pixel art, I should try a wide variety of stuff and improve my modelling skills that way. Breaking down the Mii model, you can use a couple of cylinders and spheres to make a basic Mii. And that's exactly what I did to start things off. I started with the body using a cylinder. After scaling it for a while, I got it to the right shape. After messing around with the tools for a while, I got to the point where I figured out how to kinda use this tool called Bevel for a much better result. Spoiler alert, I didn't actually learn how to use it properly until much later. After getting a rather satisfying result for the body, I decided to mess around with the tools once more. You see, I had found out about this feature called Mirror, and I spent about 10 to 20 minutes just figuring it out and watching a tutorial for it. It took me a while, but I managed to get the mirror effect and began working on the arms. By doing this, the amount of time spent on the model itself was significantly reduced, and it looked a lot better. After connecting the arms to the body, I used a neat trick that my friend gave me, which was to highlight the vertices you want to connect to them, and connect them by pressing F. Although that wasn't the most desirable result, It did leave me satisfied for me to leave it alone and potentially not mess it up any further, as I often do with apps that I have no knowledge on. I used the same method for the legs, so that didn't take too long, and the head was just a piece of cake at the end of it all. I did try to make the hair, but I just gave up at it at the end, because I knew that it was going to be a disaster. It was already pretty obvious in the last 2 days my improvement in Blender was pretty fast. But I was determined to learn Blender by the time this 1 week was over. So I decided to return to basics and re-watch what I had always avoided watching. The tutorials for Blender were a couple of hours long altogether, and my task for day 3 was to make myself a donut, and I was going to texture it as well. Thanks to the channel Blender Guru, I found myself a series of videos that was to help me modelling and making a donut in Blender. By doing this, I would pick up any tips and tricks using the video to use in making a donut. I skipped the first tutorial because I thought, surely I don't need to learn about this, I already got a good grasp of navigation, and I'm starting to get a good grasp of the interface as well. So let me just move straight into modelling. First started off by adding a torus shape after deleting the cube. I learned to adjust the shape right after adding it to give it a nice thick shape, the type of shape that donuts have. After all, there's no such thing as a thin donut. I also learned the tool Shade Smooth, which gives the illusion of a mesh being smooth instead of being polygonal. After that, I learned stuff such as the proportional editing tool, which allowed me to grab one vertice, and from grabbing that one vertice, and wherever I moved it, it would affect the entire mesh up to a certain point. By doing this, I was able to give the donut an uneven surface to make it more realistic. After that was done, I began working on icing, which began with me duplicating the donut and cutting off half of it and scaling it. After that, I began working on icing, which began as me duplicating the donut, cutting off half of it, and scaling it to be slightly larger than the donut. From there, I kinda took it over from there and started to stray away from the tutorial, because I thought, I've been improving in Blender for a while now, so I should be able to do stuff slightly by myself. It wasn't a disaster, but my donut did not look how Blender Guru's one did, and I was slightly disappointed. Now it was time to make the icing look drippy. I decided to go without a reference for the first few minutes, but I realised if I did not use one, then I'm probably going to mess up. After about 5 minutes of scrolling through Google to get a decent enough picture, I found a stack of donuts, and while it wasn't what I wanted, I wasn't willing to waste any more of my time. Instead of using one of the stacked donuts to make my icing, I decided to use multiple of them and make my donut have variety in its icing. To finish it off, I used shrink wrap to make the icing wrap around the donut, but after ticking off all the modifiers before moving into sculpting, I began to notice something was off. The time I moved into sculpting, I was moving into completely unknown territory, Blender. I learned how to use it quickly and fell in love with how easily I could edit my mesh. Instead of inflating the parts of the icing to make it look more drippy, I strayed off completely and began to make swirls with the donut to give it more of a satisfying look. I went into the tutorials thinking that I'd be able to model and texture it in the same day, but clearly that wasn't going to work because I had only gotten modelling and sculpting out of the way, so my main goal was to continue from where I left off on day 3 to get the texturing out of the way. Instead of getting straight into the texturing, I was instead brought into the first tutorial called rendering, and this is where I took way longer than I should have. The first 20 minutes literally was me trying to figure out how to adjust the camera option properly, and I realised that there was a problem in navigation. It would only let me zoom in and out to a certain point, which was annoying. After watching a short tutorial, I learned how to go into Blender preferences, go to navigation and uncheck the box depth, and from there it became a lot easier to zoom in and out. After taking absolutely forever to get the camera to a satisfying position, I learned to switch from wireframe, solid, material preview, and rendered easily by holding down letter Z. From there, I could switch my model to that of a preferred choice. I also learned about the 3 different render engines that come to Blender, which is Cycles, Eevee, and Workbench. I started off using Eevee, but I would eventually grow a preference for using Cycles instead. I added a plane and placed it below the donut after scaling and adjusting it multiple times to give a donut a surface to rest on, instead of it floating in midair. After doing that, I learned how to adjust light to give the donut a much more desirable result, by adjusting the power of the light and its position, while adjusting the shadow at the same time as well. I began learning about materials and gave the icing a donut-based colour. From that, I thought that texturing was really simple. I needed to adjust the settings for the material to give it the perfect look, right? Oh boy, I was not prepared for what happened next. I adjusted the camera for the final time to get a satisfying look for when it was finally rendered, and decided to render the image for the first time. This is how it looked like. What really confused me next was going into the shader section, because there were so many options to give me a different type of outcome, and I had absolutely no idea what each node did. I started off by adding a noise texture and adding it to the base color, then placed a color ramp in between them and adjusted the color. I learned about image texture and added to the base color. Maybe I had a bit too much fun using it. To finish it off for day 4, I added a texture coordinate and added a vector bump to it to give it more of a real look. Day 5 was going to be the day where I would finally finish the donut once and for all. First I used the image texture and selected new. I then changed the height and width of the image to 512 x 512 and started on it after selecting my main color. For this I moved over to the texture paint workshop and began to properly texture it this time. The task for this was simple. All I had to do was add white to the middle of the donut and move back to the shader workspace, and from there I finished the donut off. Also, I should probably mention that I'd forgotten to save the textures, so I lost them later on. After that I moved on to the icing and decided to just use nodes that worked well and added to the icing. Like the donut, I added the bump texture to it and turned it down a lot. After that I decided to change the subsurface color to a much lighter color instead of dark purple, which really gave the donut an ugly look. After messing around with controls a bit more, I felt satisfied and felt it was time for me to move on to the next stage, adding the sprinkles. To talk about how I did the sprinkles, I would first have to talk about geometry nodes. Introduced very recently by Blender, according to Blender Guru, it allows you to do a lot of things with it, and I didn't know anything about it except that I was using it for the sprinkles. After changing my workspace to a geometry nodes workspace, I began with distributing the points on the face, and then used geometry afterwards. To start the sprinkles after I finished the donut, I added a cylinder and scaled it, then dragged into the geometry node section for the icing. It took me a while to adjust the sprinkles to actually appear in the donut, so I had to restart the geometry nodes process all over again to get what I wanted. After applying both scale and rotation to it, I added rotation Euler to it and rotated a lot by Z. I then went into a new section called weight paint, where places with the most sprinkles would be red and the least would have blue. I then edited 2 of the sections of group input to have sprinkles density and weight paint, and connected them to the distribute nodes on the faces. By this time this actually started to look like a donut sprinkles, but it wasn't over yet. I turned down the sprinkles density a lot and used a subdivision modifier before starting working different types of sprinkles. To do this, I basically duplicated the first sprinkle used in geometry nodes, adjusted them to have different variety in shapes and sizes. To finish the donut off, I went into the shading workspace and used the color ramp to give the sprinkles a variety color. This is how it looked like. Now for those wondering what happened with the donut, I decided I had gotten the donut to the point where it looked decent, but I didn't want to spend the last 2 remaining days working on it. I needed something new. So I thought, why don't I spend days 6 and 7 working on something entirely based on what I learned from my own imagination. Tutorials to be used if needed, of course. Fortunately, it didn't take me that long to figure something out. You see, episode 5 of the Mr. Pixelated series, Mr. Pixelated vs Johnny Boy, was beginning to be worked on again, and I thought that a very simple task was to create a background for the opening scene. The opening scene was basically going to be a living room zooming out slowly with shadow watching TV, which seems pretty simple at the same time. I should put all the skills I have learned to the test. I started off by making a wall and floor, first renamed the cube that I was working with to that and began modulating it. I first scaled it down so it could be flat and resized it so it could be a wide flat surface. Using loop car, I cut out a section which I then extruded it to make the wall. Then scaled it once more for it to be the perfect size for the scene. I then adjusted the camera to a good position before starting work on other projects that would be used in the scene. Now that the background was looking decent, I was going to keep adding objects to the scene until I got what I wanted. My first object to add to the scene was a table. I added a cube and, like the room, I scaled it to make it look wide and flat. After using loop cuts to make it into small squares, I extruded the legs of the table before adding the completed table to the scene. My second object was of course going to be the TV, which sits on the table. This was meant to be something that was easy to make, but because of the stupid mistakes I made, things became so much harder than it should have been, although I learned some things in the process of doing so. Instead of using inset faces to make the screen, I used bevel faces multiple times on one side, and I did that multiple times, which became a huge problem later on. I instead switched to the other side and used bevel faces again, which for some reason actually worked this time. I won't mention what happened later in finishing the TV off. It was ridiculous trying to finish it off, and multiple mistakes were made along the way. But after a ridiculous amount of time working on it, I finally completed it. Using the add cube option, I changed up the room slight bit to make it look more realistic, and not so bland. Added plug and plug socket, which took way longer than it should have. Then I adjusted the lights so it could be at the TV instead of having a lit room, because having a dark room with only the TV is pretty cool in my opinion. By the time I rendered the image for the first time 2 hours into making it, this is how it looked like. I added a wire to finish things off along with a mug right next to the TV. Before starting on the colouring, I gave the TV a dark grey colour while I gave the room an orange colour, with the blood being a very light grey. The table of course was given a brown colour, while everything else that wasn't a colour remained white. I also learned how to UV edit and texture properly from a separate tutorial, as I wanted to assign different parts of the room different colours. It didn't take too long for that to happen, and after about half an hour, it was looking decent. For day 7, nothing really happened. I decided to finish it off by doing a simple animation of the camera slowly zooming out to reveal the entire scene. After a while, this is how it looked like. I gave the table a wooden texture that was poorly done and with a glossy look, reflecting the light coming from the TV with a mixed shader. I messed around with everything else a bit to finally get the result I wanted, and this is how it looked like. So, is it possible to learn Blender in a week? Well, kinda. I didn't learn as much as I expected to learn, but I now have a good grasp of the software, how to use it, and a good understanding of it. I didn't really have enough time to spend on it per day as I was quite busy and I was only able to afford 3 hours each day using Blender. Obviously, if I had more time each day, then I would be able to learn more in that 1 week. Anyways, thanks for watching the video. This took me a lot of time to put together, and I overall really enjoyed making this video. If you guys want a part 2 to this video for me to start a Blender series, then this video has to reach 50 likes, or I'm not making another one of these videos. Maybe. But until then, I'll be seeing you in the next video.